Well, as we told you earlier, we'll be having the Minister for Industrialization, Adan Mohammed. We're glad he could join us. Thank you very much for making time for us. And of course, Martin Kisu of Taxwise Consulting. Again, thank you very much for making time for us. Should I dare ask you, what do you make of the budget? I'm sure you're okay with it.
Yes, I think the budget is a good one. It has touched on quite a number of areas that are critical for this country. And, you know, whilst the expenditure amount is historic and significant, I think the spread of it has touched on all the critical areas that this country really needs. So for that reason, I think, you know, it's fairly well spread in terms of addressing some of the key challenges that this country has had.
Is that the same for you?
Well, yes, I'm not disappointed because I was not expecting a lot. Firstly, the new administration didn't have a lot of time to bring their own new thinking. And secondly, this is within the mid-term expenditure framework that was launched last year, which covers 2012-2017. And what I'm happy about is, you know, the government is still keeping track with that framework, paying emphasis on things like infrastructure, security, and social safety nets, looking at vulnerable groups and people who are disadvantaged.
Is that the right thing for him to say? The new administration did not really have time to do much thinking about this budget?
Well, I think the administration knows its priorities, and those priorities are fairly well defined. If you talk to a business person, you know, a common person who is out there, the disadvantaged group, the vulnerable people in this country, the kind of issues that we have in terms of security and social services, be it in health or education, these are all things that I think everybody in the country knows about. And so the distribution of some of these resources along those lines, whilst very much aligned to the current government's priorities, are issues that I think have well been known to many people.
And it goes hand in hand with the Jubilee administration's policy or promise of lowering the cost of living. But then we have the reintroduction of the VAT bill. Is that doing the direct opposite, depending on the contents of the bill?
I think it's important for people to understand what the bill is about. The VAT bill is something that has been doing the rounds for a while. The whole intention of reintroducing the bill is to try and see how compliance with the VAT as a whole can actually be improved. There's a lot of complexity about administration of VAT, compliance, and making sure that actually, you know, all the people who are supposed to pay VAT actually do pay. And so it's intended to do a lot of simplification, much more than the existing, you know, VAT has had already. But I think at the moment there's a lot of noise about, you know, new VAT being introduced. I think it's just a revision of an existing act, you know, that is intended to try and see how we can simplify things.
Will that touch then, if we make it simpler for what people are saying, will that touch that then on the basic commodities? We know they had been zero rated.
Yeah.
You're saying it's not a new bill, it's a reintroduction of what was there before. Will that mean then we'll have tax on the basic commodities?
I think to the extent that the bill is going to be debated on what it will and will not touch on, the whole idea is to make sure that the base of things that it should cover should be fair across the board for everybody. And so without necessarily discussing the details and the specifics of it, the overall objective of it is to make sure that it's much more broader, much more easier for compliance purpose, and easy for people to understand.
As it is now, it has been through the cabinet level, I believe.
Yes, it has.
Do we know if it's touching on the basic commodities?
I think it will touch to some extent.
It will touch to some extent.
Yeah.
So Kenyans can expect some basic commodities will have some tax on them.
I think these are things that will change over time. From time to time, some of these things can be introduced, and other times it can be changed. But for now, I think the gist of the bill is just to make sure that, you know, a lot more simplification, a lot more compliance with the VAT Act is actually achieved.
What impact will that have in line with the Jubilee government's promises?
Well, this bill first came into the scene around 2011, and to my mind, I would say that it was not a very well thought out project. And it seems, again, up to today, it is still not a very well thought out project, and I have no doubt in my mind it's going to crash. We have a lot of experience with introduction of VAT in many jurisdictions. When you rewrite the VAT bill, you are essentially in the same position as a jurisdiction that is introducing VAT for the first time. You have to engage taxpayers, you have to engage the stakeholders so that there is a lot of buy-in upfront before you put a bill into Parliament. Now, this is the third time we're going to see government pushing through a VAT bill that has not been discussed with the stakeholders. And to hear that it is still going to impose VAT on basic necessities, I don't need to take a bet with you, it's going to crash.
It's going to crash.
Yeah.
That's what he says. You believe so? And parliamentarians already are saying if it touches on that, they're not going to approve that.
Well, I think the process through which a bill goes through before it becomes law is very clear. And so stakeholders will no doubt be accessing the contents of it and will debate, and the right decision will be made ultimately. So it's not something that is being effected today. It's a process that has to go to Parliament, and parliamentarians no doubt will actually debate it appropriately and see whether it's a good thing for the country. You
believe as a government you can work around it with the National Assembly?
I think the thing is we must do what is right for the country, what is right for the intentions for which the bill is intended to arrive at. What is happening is, at the moment, there's a lot of complexity in a bill, in an act that has been there for a very long time. And this is intended, with all its potential faults that my colleague is actually just talking about, is intended to actually bring about much more simplification. And it will go through the necessary parliamentary process to make sure that all the necessary stakeholders' views are heard.
I want to emphasize this one more time, and I'll ask you, what bearing does that have in the cost of living? Against what the Jubilee Manifesto has promised, against what the Jubilee administration has promised, if of course it goes through?
We've not seen the contents of the VAT bill, but if it's still the same bill we looked at last year, VAT bill 2012, definitely it's going to impact on cost of living, because what government is calling simplification of VAT is simply to cut down on the number of items that enjoy zero rating, so that you have practically everything and anything that is supplied in this economy subjected to VAT. That is their definition of simplification of VAT. But I have not been told what is so complex about our VAT legislation such that you want to hit the poor in the name of simplifying the law. What is the complication about the VAT law? If you're talking in terms of the revenue take that we make from the VAT, then I think the Kenyan VAT system is one of the best performing VAT systems in the world. And there are numbers to prove that. Our VAT system is very, very efficient in terms of raking in revenue, and the numbers to back that one. So it's not a matter of it's not a matter of tax efficiency, it's not a matter of complication. I think the nagging question for government is the ever spiraling VAT refund backlog. And so when you cut down on the number of items that are zero rated, or the number of goods and services that are zero rated, the number of people who enjoy the zero rate status, you reduce the amount of VAT refunds. But I don't think the question of VAT refunds should be a burden to anyone. Can
I just comment on the cost of living and what this does?
Yes.
I think the cost of living that many Kenyans experience doesn't necessarily come from an introduction of a VAT like this. Where it comes from are actually much more fundamental issues. Where people are living in situations where insecurity is very high, businesses in particular, load these costs. And as businesses' cost of doing business itself increases, these are passed to consumers. Look at the cost of transport in this country. Think about how much it costs to move a cargo from Mombasa to Nairobi. Look at the cost of energy. Look at how much it costs to provide medical services. These are the things that drive the cost of living in this country. And I think what the budget has done today is to really address the bottom of some of these big elephants that we have in this country. And once the back of that is broken, I think the long-term solution is to see the cost of living come down in line with the government's promise.
Finally, very briefly, because of time, another thing that seems to be going against what the Jubilee administration had promised in terms of creating an enabling environment for investment is the capital gain tax. That is going to be introduced again.
Well, at the moment, just for a record, I think what the Cabinet Secretary said is there will be a review to see, how capital gains tax can be looked at with a view to, increasing potential sources of revenue within our tax base. So that will be discussed, undoubtedly will be debated. And it's not an unreasonable thing to do. It's the kind of tax that a lot of jurisdictions actually do. But at the moment, as it stands, there's no specification that is going to come into effect tomorrow. But what I really think is important is the fact that, the business community has been asking for things in this country. They've been asking the government to improve the ease of doing business, to your point. And this is about providing improvement in energy costs, improvement in logistics, improvement in security. And if you look at the allocation into those key sectors, that is what I think is going to improve the way we do business in this country.
Finally, of course, I'm going to ask about the deficit and finance gap, 163 billion shillings. Already we are supposed to pay 18 billion per month in terms of the 216 billion that is supposed to be repaid. Do you think it's a bit too ambitious for the government, and how are they going to realize this and finance the budget itself?
Well, it shouldn't be too ambitious. We shouldn't be running huge deficits. I don't think we have exhausted the capacity to raise substantial tax revenues, even to fund our budget 100% without having to borrow or to look for grants. I think it is time now, as a country, we have to address what we are doing with our capacity to raise tax revenues, which is something we don't talk about. And when we talk about revenue leakage, we are always talking about revenue leakage in terms of small traders dodging to pay their tax liabilities. But the truth of the matter, which is not being discussed openly, is that there's quite a lot of tax revenue collected, but doesn't get where it's supposed to get.
Is that so, finally, because of time?
Well, I think the desire to do a lot of things for the country to address some of the issues around doing business and reducing the cost of living in this country is exactly what the government has addressed. That requires significant amount of resources. So running a deficit, I think, is not necessarily an unusual thing to do. It's how it's funded and the negative consequence of that if it just gets out of control. I think the level as it is at the moment is manageable. Clearly, the objective of the government is to try and see how revenue base can be increased. But you can't wait for that and forego to deal with issues like security and transport and rail that has actually been introduced.
Okay, thank you very much. Cabinet Secretary Industrialization, Adan Mohammed, thank you very much for making time for us. And Martin Kisu from TaxWise Consulting, thank you very much for making time for us. Again,